It began like a whisper, a trail of death so carefully staged, so precisely executed, that investigators in 3 continents would spend years chasing a phantom they could never touch. A killer who moved between countries with the ease of a shadow. His victims numbered not in tens, but in hundreds. And his calling card was always the same, a single black feather. In 2012, a young couple visiting New York checked into a midtown hotel. Hours later, hotel staff would find their bodies lying on the bed, untouched valuables still on the table, no signs of forced entry. But in the center of the husband's chest lay a black feather. It was the first sign that a serial predator had arrived. At first, detectives thought it was an isolated case, a personal grudge. Perhaps. There was no forced entry, no struggle, no fingerprints, and no trace of the killer on CCTV. But the feather, that was unforgettable. Whoever this was, he wanted to be remembered. Weeks later, more deaths followed. A businessman in Chicago, a family of 4 in San Francisco, a woman traveling alone in Dallas. Each time, the scene was the same. Bodies neatly arranged, valuables untouched, a feather resting on the chest of at least one victim. The FBI was called in, recognizing they were facing a serial predator unlike any they had encountered before. Over the course of 18 months, at least 50 murders were linked to what became known as a feather case. Yet the choice of victims defied all profiling. Honeymooners, tourists, professionals, families. The killer appeared to strike without pattern. The only thread connecting the crimes was a ritual and the haunting symbol left behind. As investigators scrambled, fear spread. Tourists began canceling trips. Hotels quietly hired extra security. Rumors filled newsrooms and tabloids. They began to call him the Phantom, a man without a face, without a trace. Profilers suggested he was intelligent, highly mobile, and obsessed with symbolism. The feather was not decoration, it was a performance, a statement. He was killing not just to end lives, but to create a legacy of fear. By 2014, panic grew. Some travelers checked out of hotels at midnight, too terrified to sleep. Families kept lights on through the night. Hotel clerks whispered about the phantom stalking the hallways. But just as authorities began tightening their net, the killings in America stopped. And then, 2 months later, in Paris, the phantom struck again. This time, in the heart of culture and history, a museum. In Paris, a night security guard at the Musée d'Orsay failed to check in during his routine radio call. His partner went searching, only to discover the man sprawled across the marble floor of the sculpture gallery. The cause of death appeared to be a single, precise cut across the throat. Near his hand, placed neatly as if for display, was a feather. Within days, more incidents followed. In Madrid, a wealthy tourist couple was found dead inside the Prado Museum after hours. In Rome, a young curator was discovered lifeless beneath the towering columns of the Capitoline museums. Always the same calling card. Always a feather. Interpol became involved, recognizing that this was no longer a localized problem. The Phantom had gone international. He was traveling through Europe's cultural landmarks, transforming them into crime scenes. And with every feather left behind, his legend grew. The European press exploded with coverage. The killings were labeled artistic murders. Headlines blared, "The Phantom haunts Europe." Security at major museums doubled overnight, but no one could predict where he would strike next. He slipped in and out, unseen, choosing victims as if plucking them from the air. Forensic evidence offered no relief. No fingerprints, no DNA, no signs of forced entry. Authorities suspected he had inside help or that he was skilled at bypassing security systems. The precision suggested military or intelligence training. Yet no agency could place him. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. In Berlin, his cruelty reached a new stage. A gala event at a private gallery was cut short when guests stumbled upon the body of a young woman in the restroom. Again, valuables untouched. Again, the feather. The boldness was staggering. Hundreds of people had been inside, yet he moved like a shadow, invisible to every watchful eye. A sense of dread spread across Europe. Parents hesitated to take children to museums. Tourists canceled trips. Governments scrambled to reassure the public, but the Phantom was already outpacing them. His murders carried an almost ritualistic quality, as though each act was part of a carefully staged play, and the feather was his signature on the final scene. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished from Europe. Weeks turned into months with no new murders. Authorities clung to the hope that maybe he had died, been arrested for another crime, or simply lost interest. But deep down, investigators knew better. The Phantom didn't stop. He waited, and soon, his silence was broken again. But this time, he had moved to a new continent. His stage was Africa. In Lagos, Nigeria, a family outing to a pleasure park turned into one of the most haunting crimes the country had ever seen. On a warm Saturday afternoon, hundreds of visitors filled the grounds. Children laughed, rides spun, vendors sold food. But among the noise and life, the Phantom slipped in unnoticed. By evening, when the park began to thin out, a young woman was found seated on a bench, her lifeless body propped upright as though she was still enjoying the breeze. On her lap, a feather rested, light and dark against her dress. The horror spread fast. The park had been crowded, a perfect cover, and yet no one had seen him strike. CCTV cameras showed nothing unusual, just a crowd, faces blurred in the summer heat, and then the girl, motionless. It was as though the killer had walked among them, invisible in plain sight. From Lagos, the Phantom moved with merciless speed. In Nairobi, Kenya, during a wedding celebration, his cruelty reached a grotesque stage. The bride's cousin, a young man of 22, was found dead just outside the hall where music and laughter filled the air. His body was posed carefully, one hand clutching a flower, and on his chest lay the feather. The joy of the wedding dissolved into panic as guests realized the killer had struck in their midst. Police officers in both Nigeria and Kenya were baffled. The killings were silent, precise, and without motive. The victims had no connection to each other. They were random, chosen for reasons only the Phantom understood. African authorities contacted Interpol, confirming what investigators already suspected. The Phantom was moving across borders with ease, choosing new territories, and leaving trails of fear behind him. In South Africa, he escalated again. Johannesburg hosted an industrial expo, and thousands gathered to witness new machinery and welding demonstrations. Amid the crowd, a respected engineer was found collapsed near the welding floor, his throat slit so cleanly it almost appeared surgical. People had been only feet away, sparks flying, machines humming, and yet no one saw the act. On the cold concrete beside him was a feather. It became clear that the Phantom thrived on spectacle. He wanted to prove that no crowd was too large, no event too secure. He could kill at will, in the middle of life and celebration, and vanish like smoke. His crimes were performance, each feather a mocking bow to the audience left behind. The African press exploded with fear and fury. Radio stations debated how a single man could evade not only local police, but Interpol and FBI agents. Ordinary people whispered about curses, spirits, the supernatural. How could a man walk among so many, kill, and disappear without a trace? Rumors began to swirl that he had accomplices, or that he was part of a powerful secret organization. But to investigators, one fact remained certain. This was the work of a single predator who thrived on control, ritual, and fear. By now, his body count had passed 100. America, Europe, Africa, no continent was safe. And yet, still, no one had seen his face. But the Phantom's arrogance was growing. And it was that arrogance, the belief that he could never be caught, that would lead him to his last mistake. For years, investigators had only fragments, whispers of a man who seemed more myth than reality. But as his crime spread across continents, a clearer picture began to form. The Phantom, they believed, was not a random drifter. He was a man with training, deliberate, meticulous, and disciplined in his craft of death. Interpol analysts pieced together small consistencies, the angle of his cuts, the silence of his approach, the clean vanishings. These were not clumsy acts of rage. They were executions, refined and practiced. Former military? Perhaps. Intelligence background? Likely. Whoever he was, he had spent years learning how to move unseen, how to strike quickly, how to erase himself from a scene. The first hints of his past surfaced from Eastern Europe. Old reports spoke of a man matching his description being expelled from a special forces program for psychological instability. He was brilliant, they said, but detached, fascinated more by anatomy and control than by mission. The files ended abruptly, leaving a void that mirrored a phantom's life. Shadows, half-truths, disappearances. Other whispers suggested Africa had once been his training ground. A mercenary in conflict zones, a man who slipped into wars under false names, fighting for causes that weren't his own. Witnesses claimed he had an unusual ritual, even then. After battles, he would leave behind feathers. Soldiers thought it was a superstition. But years later, the symbol reappeared, no longer a private quirk, but a public signature of death. Psychologists studying his case noted the theatrical quality of his killings. He didn't just murder, he staged scenes, choosing places filled with meaning. Museums, parks, weddings. These were spaces of culture, joy, and life. By striking there, he transformed them into arenas of fear. It was as if he wanted to rewrite human gatherings, to remind the world that death could invade anywhere. Yet for all his precision, he was also erratic. He left no manifestos, no letters to police, no statements. Unlike many serial killers, he didn't seek to explain himself. His only communication was a feather, silent, final. Investigators gave him a psychological profile. Male, between 35 and 50, deeply intelligent, socially invisible, with training in covert operations. A man capable of blending into any culture, any crowd, slipping across borders without raising suspicion. A ghost in human form. And yet, even as experts profiled him, he remained ahead. Each time they thought they had a lead, he vanished. His international trail grew cold, only to flare up months later in a new country. He was unpredictable, choosing victims at random, which made protection impossible. But there was one weakness buried in his pattern: arrogance. Each killing had become bolder, riskier, staged before larger crowds. It was as though he wanted to prove to the world, and to himself, that he was untouchable. That arrogance would one day put him in front of the wrong set of eyes. A child's eyes. By the time the Phantom's killings reached their second year, he was no longer just a criminal. He was a global obsession. Newspapers in America, Africa, and Europe splashed his name across front pages. TV anchors whispered his deeds with grave voices. Talk shows speculated on his motives. Was he a madman, a mercenary, a ghost? People debated if he even existed, or if he was some elaborate fabrication by international media. But behind closed doors, the world's top investigative agencies knew he was real. They had seen the bodies. They had collected the feathers. They had studied the surgical precision of his killings. And they were running out of time. Interpol hosted emergency summits in Lyon, France. Representatives from the FBI, Europol, and African police forces sat in tense meetings, surrounded by maps filled with red pins, each pin marking a death. The pattern looked like a storm sweeping across the world, unpredictable and deadly. One French investigator described it bluntly: he is not a man chasing victims. He is a man chasing stages. He kills where people gather, where life is strongest, so he can poison it. The FBI took the lead in coordinating intelligence. Behavioral analysts built charts of his movements, psychological maps of his rituals. They shared data with their African and European counterparts, but the problem was the same. The Phantom left no trace, no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance image clear enough to identify him. In Nigeria, police tried to reconstruct the day of the Pleasure Park murder. Witnesses remembered a man, or maybe two, walking calmly through the crowd. Some said he was tall, others said average. One vendor insisted he wore a hat, another swore he had nothing on his head. The Phantom was smoke, shifting in every retelling. In South Africa, detectives worked through the expo footage frame by frame. Thousands of faces flickered across their screens, but no one stood out. The killer had been there. They were certain of it, but he had slipped away like he always did. Across Europe, security forces tightened controls at public events. Museums, hotels, wedding venues, parks, all received heightened surveillance. Plainclothes officers were dispatched to crowded places. Yet still, he struck again. In Berlin, a businessman was found dead in a museum restroom, feather on his chest. In Barcelona, a tourist was killed in a hotel lobby, surrounded by dozens of people who swore they saw nothing. In Paris, a university professor collapsed in a cafe, her body untouched by poison or weapon visible, yet marked by the Phantom's calling card. It was as if he was taunting them. He was saying, "I am everywhere. You cannot stop me." And with each killing, panic grew. Weddings were cancelled. Tourist attractions emptied. Even museums closed their doors, afraid of becoming the next stage for his theater of death. But behind the despair, investigators began to notice something else: his rhythm. His killings were fast, but they followed a strange tempo. He never stayed long in one place. He killed, disappeared, then resurfaced continents away. Some agents believed he was circling the globe, perhaps even preparing for a finale no one could predict. The hunt consumed resources. The FBI poured millions into task forces. African police departments stretched their manpower thin. Europol combed through immigration records, flight logs, hotel registries. But he moved with identities that were never his, forged documents, disguises. He passed borders like water slipping through cupped hands. And then, unexpectedly, hope appeared. Not through satellites, not through intelligence, not through advanced surveillance, but through the eyes of a child. In the crowded chaos of his last crime, the Phantom didn't notice he was being watched. A young boy, no older than 12, had seen it all. His memory would become the thread investigators had been desperate to find, the single thread that could unravel the Phantom's empire of death. It happened in a small coastal city in Ghana. The Phantom had chosen his stage carefully, a wedding by the ocean, a celebration of joy, music, and family. Guests in bright attire filled the venue, laughter echoing against the waves. It was the kind of place no one expected death to visit. But the Phantom did. He moved through the crowd with his usual calm, a man blending into the celebration like any other guest. His victim was a respected businessman, father of the groom, standing near the buffet with a glass raised and chair. Within minutes, he collapsed, his throat cut with a precision so swift that most guests thought he had fainted. Panic erupted when the feather was discovered on his chest. By the time screams filled the hall, the Phantom was gone, but he wasn't unseen. A boy named Kojo had been standing near the serving table, balancing a plate of rice and stew. He had watched closely, not because he was suspicious, but because he was fascinated. The man who moved so calmly caught his attention. Kojo saw the Phantom's hand, quick as lightning, slice and withdraw. He saw the feather slipped onto the victim's chest, like a final signature. He saw the man melt back into the crowd, brushing past panicked guests without a single glance behind him. Unlike the adults, who were consumed by the chaos, Kojo's young eyes had focused on details. He noticed the man's walk, his height, the faint scar on his left cheek. He remembered the peculiar ring on his hand, shaped like a coiled serpent. Most of all, he remembered the man's eyes, cold, piercing, blue. When police rushed to the scene, Kojo tried to speak, but his small voice was drowned in the storm of panic. It wasn't until hours later, when investigators canvassed the area for witnesses, that Kojo finally had the chance to tell his story. At first, the officers dismissed him. Children's memories, they thought, were unreliable, but the boy insisted. He repeated the details with a clarity that stunned even the skeptical detectives. His description matched fragments collected from earlier killings: the scar, the ring, the eyes. For the first time, someone had seen the Phantom up close and lived. Interpol agents flew in within days. Kojo was brought into protective custody, shielded from potential retaliation. Using his testimony, police artists sketched a composite image: the scar, the serpent ring, the piercing eyes. When the sketch was circulated among international agencies, it triggered a breakthrough. A retired officer in Eastern Europe recognized the face immediately. He had once trained a man like that, decades earlier, in a special forces program. The name had been scrubbed from official files, but the memory remained. A soldier dismissed for psychological instability. A man obsessed with control, anatomy, and silence. The Phantom finally had a face. And with that face, investigators began to reconstruct his trail. Immigration logs, hotel records, blurred surveillance images. All the fragments began to align. His disguises weren't perfect after all. He had left crumbs behind, and now the world's law enforcement agencies followed them hungrily. Kojo's testimony became the centerpiece of the investigation. The boy's courage to speak, to describe what he had seen, gave the world the first real chance at stopping a man who had brought death to 3 continents. And the Phantom, though still free, had made his first mistake. He had been seen. For 2 years, the Phantom had been a storm without a shadow. He moved unseen, striking with precision and vanishing before law enforcement could breathe his name. But after Kojo's testimony, everything changed. For the first time, the killer had a face, not a blurred surveillance image, not a half-formed theory, but a witness account sharp enough to pierce his mask. Interpol released a composite sketch to their closest partners. It wasn't shown to the public. Fear of panic and copycats kept it classified, but within the law enforcement community, the face became infamous. A scar along the cheek, a serpent-shaped ring, piercing blue eyes that seemed almost unnatural. The FBI took the lead, working alongside Europol, the CIA, and intelligence partners in Africa. They began piecing together the Phantom's life. They traced a training camp in Eastern Europe where he had once served. They dug into black market passports, fake identities, safe houses. The Phantom had been careful, but the world had grown smaller for him. Flight records, border logs, hotel bookings, all began to show faint patterns. Agents realized something chilling. The Phantom had always been watching them, too, in several airports. Footage revealed him sitting casually in waiting areas where Interpol teams were arriving. In one African city, a blurred image caught him outside a police headquarters just days after murder. He wasn't just avoiding the hunt. He was mocking it. But now, with Kojo's eyewitness details anchoring their search, investigators tightened the net. They formed a multinational task force, codenamed Operation Silent Veil. Members of the FBI, Interpol, Europol, and African security forces worked around the clock in a secret command center. On the walls, maps glowed with pins connected by red string. Timelines of killings stretched across digital boards. And at the center, the Phantom's scarred face stared back at them, printed 100 times over. The strategy was simple but dangerous. Predict his next move and set the stage before he did. Analysts studied his rhythm. He struck where people gathered: hotels, parks, museums, weddings, always places of joy, culture, of family. He fed on spectacle, and he never lingered in the same continent for too long. By the task force's calculations, he was due for another strike in Europe. The data pointed to Italy, a hub of tourism, festivals, and events. Rome was suggested. Venice was debated. But then, a small wedding in Florence caught their attention. It was high profile, attended by diplomats and celebrities, exactly the kind of stage the Phantom favored. So they prepared the trap. Security was doubled at the venue, but discreetly, plainclothes officers mingled among guests. Hidden cameras were installed at entrances and exits. Snipers were stationed on rooftops. Even the catering staff had been vetted. The world's most dangerous man was expected to walk among them, and no one wanted to spook him too early. Back in the command center, every screen lit with live feeds. Agents in Washington, Paris, Accra, and London all watched simultaneously. And in a small room nearby, Kojo sat with his mother, flanked by child psychologists and protective officers. If the Phantom showed his face, Kojo would be the one to confirm it. Hours ticked by. The wedding began. Guests laughed, music played, champagne flowed. For a while, it seemed the Phantom had slipped past them again. But then, a man in a dark suit appeared near the edge of the garden. He moved with the calm, deliberate rhythm Kojo had described. He wore a hat low, but his hand, when it adjusted his cuff, bore the serpent ring. The command center exploded with voices. Cameras zoomed in. Agents whispered codes into earpieces. And in the safe room, Kojo leaned forward, his eyes wide. When shown the live feed, his voice was clear. That's him. That's the man. For the first time, the world had the Phantom in their sights. The command center went silent after Kojo's confirmation. Every agent, every officer watching the live feed understood the gravity of what had just happened. For years, the Phantom had been a ghost. Now, he was flesh and blood in their cameras, moving among unsuspecting guests in Florence, Italy. Target confirmed, whispered the lead coordinator. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled. The Phantom drifted through the wedding garden with the same fluid detachment he carried at every crime scene. He smiled faintly, blending with guests as though he belonged. He picked up a champagne flute, nodded politely at strangers, even paused to admire the flowers. It was all part of his ritual, becoming invisible by acting ordinary. But this time, he was being watched from every angle. Plainclothes officers shadowed him carefully, disguised as waiters and distant relatives of the bride. On rooftops, snipers tracked his every step, fingers tight on triggers. SWAT teams waited in unmarked vans just blocks away. Helicopters circled out of sight, blades thundering above the clouds. Still, the Phantom moved like he knew. His eyes scanned the crowd, sharp, deliberate. He brushed his hand across his serpent ring, almost as if signaling to himself that tonight was his stage. And then, as the music swelled, he began to close in on the groom's father, his likely target. "Stand by," ordered the coordinator. "Do not spook him. Wait for the approach." Seconds stretched into minutes. The Phantom slipped closer, weaving through dancers. His hand moved casually inside his suit jacket. Agents recognized the motion instantly. He was reaching for the blade. Go! 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 The wedding exploded into chaos. Officers surged forward, tackling guests aside. A flashbang detonated near the entrance, sending shrieks through the garden. Before the Phantom could react, two operatives slammed into him from behind, forcing him to the ground. His champagne glass shattered, spraying liquid across the marble floor. But the Phantom did not thrash. He did not scream. Instead, he twisted with the strength of a predator, knocking one officer off balance. In an instant, a hidden knife glimmered in his hand. He slashed upward, cutting the forearm of the second officer. Gunfire erupted in the air as a warning. Guests dove for cover, tables overturned, wine spilled across white cloth. The Phantom lunged for the groom's father, his blade inches from flesh, but a sniper's voice rang through the comms. "Clear shot. Take it." The bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The blade clattered away. Officers swarmed, pinning him with knees and elbows, chaining his hands with reinforced cuffs. He thrashed once, then twice, his body convulsing with rage. But soon, the fight drained from him. His piercing blue eyes, once untouchable, flicked around the garden with something foreign. Not fear, not regret. Something colder, calculation. For the first time in years, the Phantom was not in control. As the wedding dissolved into panic, agents dragged him into a waiting van. Blood streaked his suit, his serpent ring catching the light one last time before it was stripped from his hand. Sirens wailed as a convoy sped into the night, guarded by armed vehicles and helicopters overhead. In the command center, the room erupted with applause, relief, and disbelief. Kojo sat quietly in the corner, watching the broadcast. When told the Phantom had been captured, the boy's lips trembled, then curved into the smallest, proudest smile. The Phantom had crossed 3 continents, killed hundreds without leaving more than feathers and fear behind. But his empire of silence had ended not with another victim, but with the eyes of a boy who refused to forget what he saw. And as the world celebrated his capture, one truth lingered in the minds of investigators. The Phantom had always planned his exits. The question wasn't just how he had been caught. It was whether he had allowed it to happen. The Phantom's reign of terror ended not with mystery, but with handcuffs. Across cities, smiles replaced fear, relief washed over the weary, and for the first time, the world knew peace had triumphed over his shadow. Now we ask you again, were you happy the police apprehended the Phantom in the end? Let us know in the comment below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.